With all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett, Senator Lisa Murkowski said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, your brief political career hardly qualifies you to lecture us about long-term infrastructure planning. Some of us have been working on these issues since before you passed the bar exam. The Senate committee room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the freshman representative invited to testify about infrastructure impacts on underserved communities. For 2 seconds, Crockett sat perfectly, still, her expression unchanged. Then she leaned slightly toward the microphone and replied, Senator Murkowski, my brief political career followed years representing communities that live with the consequences of the exact planning decisions this committee has made. Perhaps that is precisely perspective you have been missing. The gallery erupted in murmurs as Murkowski's expression shifted from dismissive to surprise. What happened next was not just a defense of credentials, it became a masterclass in turning dismissal into opportunity that completely transformed the power dynamic of the hearing. The Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works hearing had not been designed to make headlines titled Infrastructure Investment Planning for the Next Decade. It was expected to be substantive, but low-profile, shaping policy quietly without attracting significant public attention. Senator Lisa Murkowski, the senior Republican from Alaska, had built her reputation on these kinds of hearings. With 21 years in the Senate, she had established herself as a moderate Republican known for occasional bipartisanship and deep knowledge of energy and infrastructure issues. Her questioning of witnesses was typically thorough and substantive. If sometimes pointed, Senator Murkowski approaches these hearings like the lawyer she has explained congressional analyst Robert Chon. She is detailed, methodical, and generally more interested in policy specifics than in scoring political points, which is why her occasional sharp moments stand out even more. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing the 30th District of Texas, was still in her first term in Congress, but she was no stranger to tough confrontations. A former civil rights attorney, Crockett had quickly made her mark as an effective communicator who did not shy away from conflict when principles were at stake. Her legal background and years of representing underserved communities gave her a sharp perspective on infrastructure and environmental justice. What makes Crockett effective, said political analyst Maria Rodriguez, is her ability to connect abstract policy to concrete community impacts. She brings her courtroom experience and advocacy for marginalized neighborhoods into the legislative arena in a way that is both passionate and precise. The witness list for the hearing had included the usual mix of federal officials, industry experts, and academics, but Crockett had been invited by the Democratic chair to speak specifically about the impacts of infrastructure policy on urban and minority communities. Voices too often excluded from these conversations. The topics on the agenda were technical funding formulas for highways, prioritization criteria for water system upgrades, climate resilience requirements for new projects, and coordination among federal, state, and local authorities. These were dry subjects that affected millions of Americans, but were usually wrapped in technical jargon that buried their human impact. What no one foresaw was that a single dismissive comment would ignite the hearing and turn it into a moment destined to be studied in political communication classes for years to come. The hearing began with routine opening statements, followed by the first panel of witnesses. Crockett's turn came during the second panel, focused on communities traditionally overlooked in infrastructure planning. She began with a steady tone, thanking the committee for the opportunity to speak. She reminded them that while they discussed formulas and regulatory frameworks, there were people living the consequences in real time in my district and others like it across the country. Infrastructure is not an abstraction. She said it determines whether the water is safe to drink, whether there is public transportation to reach jobs, and whether flood protections exist for vulnerable neighborhoods. She offered vivid examples of communities forced into 3-hour commutes due to inadequate transit, children drinking contaminated water in schools from crumbling systems, and families devastated again and again by floods because of failed planning. She linked these failures directly to flaws in current infrastructure processes and proposed reforms grounded in her legal and community experience. In that moment, the freshman Congresswoman shifted the entire hearing by showing that lived experience could stand toe-to-toe with decades of seniority, and by the time she finished, even those who had dismissed her were forced to listen. Her testimony was substantive and specific, grounded in both data and direct experience. And as she concluded, several committee members were taking notes, clearly engaged with her perspective. Then came time for questions from the committee members. Senator James Richardson from Ohio asked about coordination between federal and local authorities. Senator Martinez from New Mexico inquired about climate resilience standards. Both exchanges were thoughtful and respectful, but when Senator Lisa Murkowski's turn came, the tone shifted dramatically. She began by saying, "Congresswoman Crockett, you've painted quite a picture of infrastructure challenges, but I am concerned that your testimony seems to suggest that these issues have not been priorities for this committee." She shuffled through her papers before adding, "I have been working on water infrastructure funding since 2005. Long before you entered Congress." Crockett began to respond, but Murkowski pressed on, reminding her that funding formulas have been refined through decades of careful balancing. Again, Crockett tried to clarify that her adjustments were based on demonstrated need, but then Murkowski delivered the dismissal that would change the entire dynamic of the hearing. "With all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett, your brief political career hardly qualifies you to lecture us about long-term infrastructure planning. Some of us have been working on these issues since before you." Past the bar exam, the comment lingered in the air, a classic attempt to dismiss a younger colleague by leaning on tenure rather than substance. It was a kind of remark that had silenced many newcomers in Congress before, but Jasmine Crockett was not one to be silenced. The committee room, when quiet Chairman Davis, shifted uncomfortably, while junior members exchanged glances, recognizing the familiar power play for 2 seconds. Crockett sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Those who knew her understood this as a moment of decision, not about whether to respond, but about how. Then she leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "Senator Murkowski, my brief political career followed years representing communities that live with the consequences of the exact planning decisions this committee has made. Perhaps that is precisely perspective you have been missing." The gallery erupted in murmurs as Murkowski's expression shifted from dismissive to surprise. Crockett pressed on before she could cut her off. "With respect to your tenure on this committee, Senator, I do not question your experience or dedication, but experience in making policy is not the same as experience living under that policy. The communities I represented as an attorney and now represent in Congress have decades of experience with the real-world outcomes of decisions made in rooms just like this one." Crockett's tone was not angry, but her words cut with force. "When I talk about water systems delivering lead-contaminated water to elementary schools, I am not speaking theoretically. I have represented those schools. When I discuss inadequate flood protection, I have stood with families as they gutted their homes after repeated flooding that proper infrastructure could have prevented." She paused and delivered her most pointed blow. "The funding formulas you describe, as carefully balanced, have resulted in 73% less infrastructure investment in minority communities compared to other areas with similar population density and tax base. That is not my opinion, Senator. That is data from the Congressional Research Service, your own research division." The silence in the room grew heavier as she shifted from defense to offense. "I have not come to lecture anyone on their years of service," she said firmly. "I have come to ensure that the lived experience of overlooked communities informs your next decades of planning. If that perspective seems challenging, perhaps that is exactly why it must be heard." For a moment, Senator Murkowski seemed unsure how to respond. The dynamic had flipped. The familiar tactic of silencing a junior member had failed. Chairman Davis interjected to keep the hearing moving, asking Murkowski if she had further questions. She hesitated, then recalibrated. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman," she said, and in a marked change of tone asked Crockett to elaborate on her data and methodology. Crockett explained with precision, detailing the sources and research that underpinned her claims, citing MIT, the Brookings Institution, and the Infrastructure Equity Initiative, while tying the findings back to specific funding decisions. The transformation in the room was unmistakable. Senators Richardson and Martinez leaned in, taking notes, and the gallery listened with heightened focus. When Murkowski spoke again, her tone carried candor rather than dismissal. "Those are thoughtful suggestions, Congresswoman, particularly the accountability metrics. We have struggled with meaningful outcome measurement for years. I appreciate you directing us back to the substance. Sometimes those of us who have been here a while focus too much on process and not enough on impacts." Her admission marked a visible shift. What had begun as a sharp confrontation across lines of seniority and background evolved into a substantive discussion about real issues. For the rest of the hearing, the tone stayed focused on equity, community outcomes, and the practical realities Crockett had placed at its center. By the time Chairman Davis gavelled the session to a close, he acknowledged its weight. "This has been one of our more illuminating sessions," he said. "I particularly appreciate the range of perspectives represented in the substantive exchange of ideas." A hearing that was meant to be routine had become a powerful moment reshaping not only the tone of that day's proceedings, but perhaps the lens through which future debates on infrastructure will be viewed. The comment, while diplomatic, acknowledged the unusual nature of what had transpired, and media analysts later observed how Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's response to Senator Murkowski's dismissal exemplified effective communication in hierarchical settings. What made Crockett's approach remarkable was not merely that she stood her ground, explained Dr. Jennifer Lewin, expert in political communication, but that she transformed what could have been a personal clash over credentials into a substantive conversation about representation and perspective. She did not simply defend herself, she illuminated the very gap in understanding that made her testimony valuable. As the committee adjourned and members gathered their material, something unexpected occurred. Senator Murkowski approached Crockett at the witness table. Their exchange was not captured on the official feed, but observers described it as cordial and engaged. At one point, Murkowski handed Crockett a business card, and they shook hands, a small gesture that nonetheless marked a shift from their earlier tension. The significance of that moment became clear 3 days later when Murkowski's office issued a press release announcing the creation of an infrastructure equity working group that would examine disparities in investment and outcomes. More surprising still, the release stated that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett would serve on the group. Her testimony, having highlighted critical gaps in the current approach to move, was unusual. A senior senator not only acknowledging the substance of Crockett's critique, but creating space to address it. Political observers underscored its importance. James Wilson, a seasoned analyst, noted that what had occurred was not just conflict resolution, but a senior legislator recognizing her own misplaced dismissal and taking tangible action to incorporate the very perspective she had rejected. Staffers later revealed that after the hearing, Murkowski had told Crockett, "You made some points today that we need to address more seriously. I would like to continue that conversation." Crockett, recognizing the significance of the overture from across the aisle, responded with equal directness, "I would welcome that. Senator, the communities I am concerned about do not benefit from partisan standoffs." This short but substantive exchange laid the foundation for staff-level cooperation that evolved into the working group announcement. Both offices quickly began identifying areas of alignment despite different constituencies and political leanings. What united them was frustration with systems that repeatedly failed to deliver promised outcomes. Murkowski had spent years trying to improve infrastructure and wanted to understand why some communities remained excluded, while Crockett saw a rare opportunity to turn critique into reform. The media seized on the dramatic reversal from confrontation to collaboration. Talk shows replayed clips of the tense exchange, followed by the announcement framing it as conflict transformed into productive engagement. Senator Richardson, who witnessed it, remarked that this was how Congress should work, acknowledging real tensions but channeling them into better policy rather than point scoring. Both women prioritized problem solving over pride, and the new working group soon gained attention within policy circles. Infrastructure equity, long discussed in academic and advocacy contexts, now had senior legislative champions. Dr. Elena Martinez, an infrastructure policy expert, noted that Murkowski's involvement gave the issue credibility among colleagues who might otherwise dismiss it as identity politics. By validating Crockett's critique and creating institutional space, she opened the door to reforms that once seemed impossible. Community advocates felt the shift. Robertson, director of the Urban Infrastructure Alliance, said, "We have been talking about infrastructure inequality for decades. To see a senior Republican senator not only acknowledge these disparities, but actively work to fix them, that is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." The working group held its first meeting 2 weeks after the hearing end. It was no mere gesture. Both women arrived with substantive proposals focused on reforms to funding formulas, better data collection, and accountability measures. Importantly, they brought allies. Murkowski recruited fellow Republicans